9 years is a long time to be gone. It is not a long enough time, apparently, for a neighborhood like this one to forget how to look untouched. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 61 years old, and for 9 years, 1 month, and 11 days, my name was inmate number 44RISTOL- something on a clipboard. Nobody bothered to look at twice. Before that, I was the founder and majority owner of Hayes Industrial Supply, a logistics and distribution company I built out of one leased panel van and a line of credit no sane banker should have given a 26-year-old with a pregnant wife and a folder full of hand-drawn delivery routes. By the time the federal agents came through the glass doors of my headquarters with a search warrant and an arrest order, Hayes Industrial Supply had 11 regional warehouses, 400 and change employees, and a logo on the side of 600 trucks running freight lanes from Chicago to the Gulf. They convicted me of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The prosecution built a case around a set of offshore transfers that ran on paper straight through my personal accounts. I told my lawyer, I told the judge, I told anyone who would listen for about the first 18 months that I had never authorized those transfers, never seen those documents, never even heard of half the shell entities named in the indictment. Nobody believed me. The paper trail was too clean. That was the detail that should have told everyone something was wrong, how clean it was. But clean evidence convicts a man just as fast as dirty evidence does, sometimes faster, because a jury likes tidy stories. I did not use my one final phone call from the transition facility to tell my wife I was coming home 3 months early on a clerical adjustment to my good time credits. I wanted it to be a surprise. God help me. I wanted to walk up that driveway and feel like a man arriving somewhere instead of a man being released from somewhere. I want you to understand the man I was before you hear what I saw through that window, because none of what happened afterward makes any sense without it. I grew up on the west side of Gary, Indiana, in a house where the heat went out more winters than it stayed on. My father worked the mills until his knees gave out, and then he worked a folding chair by the front window for the last 6 years of his life, watching the street, telling me that a man's whole worth could be measured by 2 things: what he built and what he refused to take from someone who trusted him. I believed that. I still believe that, even now, even after everything, because the alternative is believing my father was wrong about the one thing he was ever certain of, and I am not prepared to give them that too. I met Diane at a community college night class in 1986. She was studying accounting. I was 2 years into a business degree I was paying for with a job unloading freight at 3 in the morning. She used to save me half a sandwich from her dinner break and leave it in my mailbox at the boarding house where I lived, wrapped in wax paper, because she'd noticed I skipped lunch to save money for textbooks. I married her 11 months later in her mother's backyard, under a rented tent that leaked in one corner the entire ceremony. We laughed about that leak for 30 years. When Hayes Industrial Supply was 3 trucks and a cracked windshield I couldn't afford to fix, Diane kept the books at our kitchen table every night after she put our son down because we couldn't afford a bookkeeper, and she refused to let me hire one before we could afford it honestly. I used to fall asleep some nights with my head on that table next to her, the 2 of us buried in invoices, and wake up to find she'd draped my jacket over my shoulders instead of waking me. That is the woman I built an empire to protect. I want that on the record before anything else. Whatever she became, whatever role she played in what came later, I did not marry a monster. Something happened to her, or she let something happen to herself, somewhere in the space of the 9 years I was gone, and part of what follows is the story of me trying to understand which one it was. Our son Jason was born in 1996, the same year we broke ground on our first real warehouse. I missed his 2nd birthday because I was in Memphis renegotiating a fuel contract that saved the company from going under during a bad quarter. I missed his 8th grade graduation because a warehouse fire in Joliet needed me on site with the insurance adjusters. I have a long list like that, a list every man who builds something from nothing carries somewhere behind his ribs, a ledger of small absences he tells himself will be repaid later, with interest, once the company is stable, once the numbers are secure, once there's finally room to breathe. I kept telling myself that for 22 years. I never got to the part where I paid it back. The federal government made that decision for me. The man I brought into the business as my partner in 2001 was Martin Cole. We'd known each other since we were teenagers working the same loading dock in Gary. When his own hardware distribution venture folded during a rough stretch in the early 90s, I brought him on as operations manager, And 6 years later, when I needed someone I trusted with equity in the company, I gave him 20% of Hayes Industrial Supply. I stood up at his wedding. He stood up at mine. A second, smaller ceremony we threw for our 10th anniversary, the one where the tent didn't leak. He held Jason in the hospital hallway on the day he was born because I was too rattled to hold my own son for the first 10 minutes of his life. And I remember Martin laughing at me for it, telling me I'd face down union negotiations and hostile takeover attempts without blinking, and here I was, shaking like a kid over 8 pounds of new human being. I trusted Martin the way you trust weather you've lived under your whole life. I never once, in 26 years, considered that trust a risk. I am telling you all of this in order, plainly, without embellishment, because I need you to understand exactly how much I had and exactly who held it, before I tell you what I found when I finally made it home. I did not take a car service from the release facility. I did not call ahead. I rode a Greyhound to the outskirts of the city and then a commuter bus the rest of the way, watching Gray Highway give way to strip malls give way, eventually, to the long green lawns and iron gates of the town I used to call mine. I walked the last 2 miles because I wanted to feel my legs carry me there. 9 years of walking the same 80-yard loop does something to a man's sense of distance. I wanted to remember what a mile felt like when it belonged to me. By the time I reached the end of my own street, it was raining hard enough that the drops stung. My suit, thin, gray, standard issue, was soaked through by the time I reached the driveway, and my dress shoes, cheap ones, the facility issues, along with $100 and a bus voucher, had rubbed both my heels raw. None of that mattered. I stood at the foot of my own driveway and looked up at a house I had poured 26 years into, and for one clean, uncomplicated moment, I felt something in my chest unclench that had been clenched since the day the agents walked me out in handcuffs. The porch light was on. Diane always left it on. Some habits, I thought, outlast everything. I did not know yet how wrong that sentiment was about to prove itself. I don't know what stopped me from walking straight up to the front door. I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count in the month since, trying to find the honest answer, and the closest I can come to it is this. 9 years inside a facility with men who had spent their whole lives reading rooms before entering them teaches you something about instinct that doesn't turn off just because you're free. Some old animal part of me wanted to see the house before the house saw me. So instead of walking up the front path, I cut across the wet grass, past the rose bed Diane had been tending since Jason was in high school, and made my way along the side of the property toward the back, where the living room's floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the patio. I told myself I just wanted to see them first. I wanted one private second of watching my wife move through her evening before the noise and the tears and the questions started. I told myself a lot of things in that half minute of walking through the dark, and every one of them turned out to be smaller than the truth waiting for me on the other side of that glass. The living room was lit up gold and warm, the big stone fireplace throwing long shadows across the leather furniture I didn't recognize. New furniture, bought sometime in the last 9 years, paid for by money I could only assume was mine. Diane was standing near the sofa in a blouse I'd never seen, and for a moment I let myself just look at her. She looked well. She looked, if anything, more at ease than I remembered her looking in the last few years before my arrest, when the stress of running a company under federal scrutiny had put permanent lines between her eyebrows. She was not alone. Martin Cole was standing across from her, closer than the ordinary distance of a business conversation, and at first, God forgive me for how long I let myself believe this, I assumed he was there checking in on her, the way an old friend might check in on the wife of a man who's been gone a long time. I stood in the rain constructing that explanation piece by piece, the way you build a raft out of driftwood when you already suspect the current is too strong for it to hold. Then he reached out and put his hands on her waist, and she did not step back. I am not going to describe what I watched next in more detail than this. It went on long enough and looked practiced enough that no reasonable man standing in the cold outside his own home could have mistaken it for anything but what it was. It was not the first time. You can tell somehow, even through glass, even through 9 years of separation, you can tell the difference between a kiss that surprises two people and a kiss that has become a habit. My hands, scarred and calloused now from 9 years of prison labor in ways they had never been scarred from 26 years of building a company, curled into fists at my sides without my telling them to. I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a physical wound, sharper than anything the federal system had managed to do to me in nearly a decade. And then the living room door opened and my son walked in. Jason is 28 now. He walked into that room in a tailored suit, holding a crystal glass of what I'd guess was scotch from our own bar cart, and I braced myself, God help me. I actually braced myself for him to see what I was seeing and react the way any son should react to watching another man's hands on his mother. He didn't flinch. He walked straight past them to the bar, poured himself another finger of scotch, and said something that made Martin laugh. I pressed myself closer to the gap in the patio doors, close enough that the cold rain running off the eaves fell directly down the back of my collar, close enough to catch fragments of their voices carrying out into the wet night air. And what I heard in the next 90 seconds did something to me that 9 years in a federal penitentiary, wrongfully convicted, had never quite managed to do. It made me understand that I had not been released from prison at all. I'd simply been transferred to a larger one, with better lighting and no bars, run by the 3 people I trusted most in the world. I am going to tell you exactly what I heard. I am not going to soften it, and I am not going to explain it away because I spent the better part of the next 6 weeks refusing to soften or explain it away, and that refusal is the only reason any of what happened next was possible. Jason took a slow sip of his drink and asked Martin, in a voice as casual as a man discussing weekend plans, whether they'd heard anything yet from the warden's office about my release date. Martin adjusted his tie, an expensive one, silk, the kind I used to buy myself for board meetings, and told him not to worry. He said the facility had confirmed the release address that week. Friday, he said. The old man gets out Friday. He told my son not to worry, because he had the whole situation handled. He told him to stick to the script. I stood in the freezing rain outside my own home and heard my former best friend use the word script in reference to my homecoming, and something in me went very, very quiet. Diane's voice came next, lower, and I had to strain to catch it over the rain. She asked Martin if he was sure I would sign. She asked what would happen if I got suspicious, if I asked to see the company books before agreeing to anything. Martin laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has already won and is simply enjoying the last few minutes before the other side finds out. He told her I was a broken old man who'd just spent 9 years sleeping on a steel cot, that I had no leverage, no lawyer of my own anymore, no standing, nothing but a suit the government gave me and $100 in my pocket. He said when I walked through that door, they would play the grieving, relieved family, and once the tears and the hugging were done, they would sit me down at the kitchen table and hand me a document. He called it a retirement package. He said it with a smile in his voice that I could hear even without seeing his face. Jason, my son, nodded along and added a detail of his own, delivered as casually as a comment about the weather. $5,000 a month, he said, ought to be plenty to keep the old man quiet in some cheap apartment somewhere far away from here. Enough for groceries. Enough to stay out of the way. I stood in the dark and the rain outside the home I had built with the sweat of 180-hour weeks, and I listened to my son discuss the exact dollar figure it would take to make his own father disappear. I want to tell you, my first instinct was rage, and it was, somewhere underneath. But rage, I have learned, arrives second. What arrives first, in the space of half a second before the anger catches up, is a kind of falling. The floor of your understanding simply gives way, and for one endless moment you are in free fall with nothing solid beneath you at all. I did not smash the glass. I did not scream their names into that warm, golden room and demand they explain themselves. I want you to understand how badly some animal part of me wanted to. My hand actually found a landscaping stone near my foot in the dark, the way a man's hand will do something his mind hasn't authorized yet. But my father spent the last 11 years of his working life paying, one folding chair afternoon at a time, for a single moment when he let his hands decide something his head should have decided instead. I had promised myself somewhere in the long, quiet nights of a federal facility that I would never hand any man, any woman, any child, any circumstance, the power to make that same mistake mine. Emotion, I had learned inside those walls, watching what it did to other men, was a currency the powerful always managed to spend against you. Patience was the only currency they couldn't counterfeit. So I set the stone back down in the wet grass. I stepped backward, slowly, into the deeper dark beneath the evergreens along the property line, until the golden light from that room and the 3 familiar shapes moving inside it were reduced to something I could look at without feeling my legs go out from under me. And I made a decision, standing there soaked through in the freezing Highland Park rain, that would take me the better part of 6 weeks and every ounce of discipline I had left in me to carry out. I was not going to walk up to that door as the man I actually was that night. Furious, grieving, betrayed down to the foundation of everything I'd believed about my own life. I was going to walk up to that door as exactly the man they were expecting, broken, grateful, compliant. I was going to let them hand me their $5,000 a month and their carefully worded document, and I was going to smile, and I was going to sign nothing, not one thing, until I understood the entire shape of what had been done to me. They had spent 9 years building a story about who I had become. I decided, standing in the rain, that I was going to let them keep believing it, right up until the exact moment it stopped serving them at all. I turned away from the window. I did not walk up to the front door that night. I walked back down the driveway, out past the gate, into the rain and the dark of a street I had lived on for 2 decades and no longer entirely recognized, and I found a payphone outside a shuttered gas station 3 blocks over, and I called the only number I could still remember by heart that belonged to someone I was fairly sure had not been part of whatever this was. I did not know yet how large the thing I was calling into actually was. I only knew that whatever it turned out to be, I intended to understand every inch of it before I let a single one of them see my face again. The payphone outside the gas station on Route 9 still took quarters, which told me something about how long it had been standing there unused and unrepaired, the same way the whole neighborhood around it told me something about what 9 years does to a stretch of road nobody with money has any reason to drive down. I fed it the last of my prison stipend and dialed a number I hadn't called in almost a decade, my finger hesitating over the last digit for a full second before I pressed it, because some part of me was already afraid of what it would mean if the man on the other end had also stopped answering for me. Curtis Boyd picked up on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep, and when I said my name, there was a long silence on the line before he said it back to me. Quiet, like he was checking the word against something in his memory to make sure it was real. Walter. A pause. Walter, they told me Friday. Where are you? Are you all right? I told him I was fine, which was not true, and asked him to meet me somewhere quiet, somewhere neither of us would run into anyone we knew. He didn't ask why. That, more than anything he said in the next 10 minutes, told me Curtis Boyd was not part of whatever I had just watched unfold through my own living room window. A man who is part of a conspiracy does not agree, without a single question, to meet his target's exact terms at 6 in the morning in a diner 2 towns over. I didn't go back to the house that night. I want to be honest about the shape of the next several hours because I think it matters. I stood under the awning of that shuttered gas station until the rain thinned to a drizzle, and I let myself feel, in private, in the dark, everything I had refused to let show on my face while I stood outside that window. I am 61 years old, and I do not remember the last time I cried before that night, and I am not going to pretend I didn't, because a man who tells you he felt nothing standing outside his own stolen life is a man who is either lying to you or lying to himself, and I have had enough of both from other people to inflict either one on you now. By the time the drizzle stopped, I had made my way to a motel 3 miles off the interstate, a low, flat, single-story building called the Route 9 Lodge, with a red vacancy sign that buzzed like a trapped insect. I paid cash, the $100 the facility gives you, minus bus fare, minus the $3 for the payphone calls, and the clerk behind the plexiglass barely glanced up from his television to take it. I lay on top of the bedspread with my shoes still on and stared at a water stain on the ceiling that had dried into roughly the shape of the state of Ohio, and I asked myself the only question that mattered: what else don't I know? Curtis was already in a back booth when I arrived at the diner the next morning, a folder in front of him that he hadn't opened yet, like he wasn't sure whether he wanted me to see what was inside it before I'd had coffee. He looked older than 9 years should have made him. Curtis had handled the business side of Hayes Industrial Supply for 18 years before my arrest, and the gray that had only been starting to show at his temples back then had taken over the whole of his hair. He looked, more than anything, relieved to see me, and I filed that away too. A guilty man does not look relieved. A guilty man looks calculating. They told everyone you signed off on it, he said before I'd even finished sliding into the booth. The restructuring. There's supposedly a signature. He turned the folder around and pushed it across the table. I looked at the page for longer than I needed to, because I already knew, the instant my eyes found the line, that it wasn't mine. I have signed my name something like 40,000 times across 4 decades. On invoices, on loan applications, on report cards, on the deed to the house I just stood outside of in the rain, and I know exactly where my hand hesitates on the second Y in Hayes, a small hitch nobody taught me, and nobody could reasonably fake without years of studying my hand the way a forger studies a signature he intends to sell. This signature didn't hitch. It was close. Close enough to fool a notary in a hurry, close enough to fool a board that wanted to be fooled, not close enough to fool me. That's not my signature, I told him. Curtis didn't look surprised. He'd clearly suspected as much before I ever walked in, which meant he'd spent some period of time, I didn't yet know how long, sitting with a suspicion he hadn't been able to prove and hadn't known who to bring it to, because the man whose signature was in question had been sitting in a federal facility with no ability to confirm or deny anything at all. He told me what he knew, laying it out with the careful, deliberate pacing of a lawyer who has learned the hard way that delivering bad news too fast just means delivering it twice. While I was awaiting trial, in the 18 months between my arrest and my conviction, Martin had gone to Diane repeatedly. Not once, not in a single dramatic conversation, but in what Curtis described as a steady, patient campaign, telling her the company was in danger of collapsing under the weight of the federal investigation, that creditors were circling, that clients were pulling contracts the moment my name appeared in the business press. He told her the only way to protect the house, the accounts, the future for Jason was to grant him decisive authority to act on the company's behalf while the situation with me remained unresolved. Diane, according to Curtis, who had sat through at least 2 of these conversations himself in the early months, had resisted at first. She'd wanted to wait for my trial. She'd wanted to talk to me. But Martin had been relentless in a way that Curtis, even now, still seemed slightly stunned by, showing up at the house unannounced with financial projections, calling her late at night when the anxiety of a husband in a county holding cell and 2 adult children calling every day asking whether their father was really a criminal had worn her down to something thinner and more frightened than the woman I remembered. I asked Curtis, point blank, whether he believed Diane had known she was signing something fraudulent. He was quiet for a long moment. I believe, he said finally, that she believed she was protecting this family. I don't think she understood what she was protecting it from becoming. I did not, in that diner booth, forgive her. I want to be clear about that, because I know some part of this story is going to sound eventually like the story of a wife who was manipulated into betrayal and a husband who found some easy peace with that fact. That is not quite what happened, and I am not going to pretend it is simpler than it was. But I did, sitting across from Curtis with my coffee going cold, allow myself to hold 2 things in my hands at the same time for the first time since I'd stood outside that window. The fact that Diane had signed something she should never have signed, and the fact that a man neither of us had fully reckoned with yet had spent months, maybe longer, engineering the exact set of fears required to make her do it. "Denise still there?" I asked. Denise Whitfield had run the front desk and half the informal communications network of Hayes Industrial Supply for 19 years before my arrest. The kind of employee who knows more about what's actually happening inside a company than half the executives on the org chart. Curtis nodded. "She's still there. Different name on the building now, though." I asked him what he meant. He told me the company had been operating as Cole Hayes Logistics for the last 8 months, ever since Martin had used the power of attorney Diane signed, under the banner of an emergency restructuring vote, to formalize his position as majority operating partner. Curtis said it carefully, watching my face the whole time, the way a man watches for a crack in a dam he already suspects is failing. I didn't give him one. I have had a great deal of practice in the last 9 years not giving anyone the reaction they are watching for. "There's something else," Curtis said, and reached into the folder for a second document, this one older, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges in a way that told me it had been sitting in a drawer for a long time before anyone had reason to pull it out again. Back in 2011, when the recession nearly took the company under. You remember that stretch. I remembered it. It had been the worst 18 months of my professional life up to that point, before the federal government showed me what worse actually looked like. We'd come within 6 weeks of missing payroll twice. "You let me set up a family trust," Curtis said. 41% of the operating company, held separately from the main partnership structure. You called it paranoid at the time. I told you paranoid men keep their families fed. I remembered that conversation almost word for word, sitting in my old office with the door closed, Curtis laying out a structure I'd thought at the time was overly cautious, a hedge against a catastrophe I couldn't quite picture. I remembered signing the paperwork mostly to make him stop worrying, the way you agree to buy the extra insurance policy the salesman is convinced you need. I had not thought about that trust in years. I had, if I am being fully honest, nearly forgotten it existed at all, which meant there was a real and uncomfortable chance that Martin, who had never been part of that particular conversation, had forgotten it too, or never known about it in the first place. 41% of the company never went anywhere, Curtis said, sliding the document toward me. It's still sitting exactly where you put it 14 years ago. As far as I can tell from what's become public since the restructuring, nobody at Cole-Hayes Logistics has ever filed anything against it, referenced it, or accounted for it in any of the paperwork Martin used to consolidate control. I sat with that for a long moment, turning the old yellowed pages over in my hands, feeling something shift in my chest that was not quite hope. I was not ready yet to call it hope, but was something adjacent to it, a foothold. The first solid thing I had found to stand on since I'd stepped off that patio and back into the dark. He doesn't know it's there, I said, mostly to myself. I don't think he does, Curtis said. But Walter, a piece of paper from 14 years ago and a forged signature aren't enough to take a company back from a man who spent 8 months building a public story about your incapacity. If we move too early, with too little, he'll bury it. He has the lawyers, the board relationships, and right now, he has your wife's signature on documents that make him look like the man who saved this family, not the man who stole from it. He was right, and I knew he was right, and it cost me something significant to sit in that booth and agree to move slowly, because every instinct built over 61 years of being a man who solved problems the moment he identified them was screaming at me to walk into that company's headquarters that same afternoon and demand answers from everyone in the building at once. But I had learned something in 9 years that I don't think I could have learned any other way, and it is this. The men who survive prison well, not the men who simply endure it, but the ones who come out of it sharper than they went in, are the ones who understand that patience is not passivity. Patience, done correctly, is the most aggressive thing a man without power can do. It is the only weapon available to someone who has been stripped of every other kind. I need 6 weeks, I told Curtis. Maybe 8. I need to know exactly what he's done, exactly who else knew, and exactly how deep it goes before I walk back into that house. Curtis studied me for a long moment across the table, and something in his expression told me he was seeing, for the first time since I'd sat down, not the broken man Martin had described to my wife and son through a living room window, but something closer to the man he'd known for 18 years before any of this happened. "Where are you going to stay?" he asked. I thought about the buzzing red sign outside the Route 9 lodge and told him I had it handled. I did not tell him, not yet, not until I understood it myself, that some part of me had already begun, in the space of a single sleepless night, to build the outline of exactly what I intended to become in the 6 weeks ahead, and exactly what I intended those 6 weeks to cost the people who thought they had already finished burying me. I found work the following week through a man named Felix Grunwald, who ran a small hardware and fittings shop 2 towns over, and had, in a previous life, been a modest account of Hayes Industrial Supply back when we still delivered to independent shops instead of exclusively to national chains. Felix didn't recognize me at first. 9 years changes a man's face more than most people expect, especially the kind of 9 years I'd had, and when I finally told him who I was, he went quiet for a long moment before offering me the room above his shop for cheap and enough odd jobs, cash in hand, to keep me fed without ever touching a bank account that might put my name somewhere Martin's people could find it. I did not tell Felix why I needed to stay invisible. He did not ask. Some men understand without needing the full story that a man rebuilding himself from the studs up needs quiet more than he needs explanations. For the first 2 weeks, I did very little except watch and listen and let Curtis work the parts of the investigation that required a law license I no longer had any standing to use myself. I learned, slowly, in fragments, the shape of what had actually happened to me, not the tidy, self-serving version Martin had delivered to Diane and Jason through a living room fireplace, but the real one, built out of property records, board minutes, and the kind of digital paper trail that men like Martin, arrogant in their success, rarely think to fully erase. Diane called Felix's landline twice during those first 2 weeks. I don't know how she got the number, I suspect Denise quietly, without either of us ever discussing it directly, had begun feeding pieces of information in both directions, a small act of loyalty to the man who used to sign her paychecks that she was careful never to name out loud. I let both calls ring through without answering. I want to tell you that was easy. It was not. Every ring of that phone was a small, specific violence against the part of me that still, despite everything I had seen through that window, loved the woman on the other end of the line. But I had not yet finished learning what I needed to know, and I had already decided, somewhere in the cold and the rain outside my own house, that the next time Diane heard my voice, it was going to be on my terms, not hers, and not Martin's. The third week above Felix's shop, Curtis called the shop phone just after closing and told me he had something I needed to see in person, something he didn't trust to a phone line even a burner couldn't fully protect. We met that night in the back office of a print shop owned by a cousin of his, a windowless room that smelled of toner and old carpet, and he laid 3 things out on the desk between us like a man dealing cards he already knew were going to change the whole hand. The first was a set of county property records. I'd asked him weeks earlier to pull the full transaction history on the Highland Park estate, expecting, at worst, to find that the house had been quietly transferred into Martin's name sometime during my incarceration, a theft dressed up as protection. What the records actually showed was worse, in a way I hadn't anticipated. The house had been moved into an irrevocable blind trust 14 months before the federal raid on my office. 14 months before anyone outside a small circle of investigators knew an investigation existed at all. I read the date twice, then a third time in case my eyes were doing something my mind wanted them to do. If the house had been shielded before the raid, that meant someone had known the raid was coming before it came. It meant the story I had been told for 9 years, the story I had told myself in a cell to make sense of my own conviction, a jealous competitor, a disgruntled employee, bad luck, an overzealous prosecutor building a career on my back, was not the true shape of what had happened to me. Someone close enough to touch my company's most sensitive financial infrastructure had built a legal shelter for my family's most valuable asset more than a year before the government ever set foot in my building. Curtis let me sit with that for a while before he pushed the second document across the desk. This one was a printed email chain, recovered through a discovery request Curtis had quietly filed in connection with an unrelated shareholder dispute, a piece of legal maneuvering I did not fully understand and did not ask him to explain, because I trusted that whatever gray area he had walked through to get it, he had walked through it carefully. The emails were between Martin and a real estate agent named Priscilla Doyle, dated 4 months before my indictment. The subject line read simply, "The Hayes property." I read through the thread slowly. Martin had asked her, in language careful enough to survive a casual read but clear enough once you knew what to look for, to begin quietly assessing the market value of a residential estate in Highland Park, to keep the inquiry off any formal listing platform, and to be discreet, in his words, given the sensitivity of the situation, 4 months before my indictment, before any public accusation existed, before Diane had any reason at all to believe our home was in danger from anything but ordinary bad luck. The third document was a single sheet, a transcript Curtis had typed out himself from a voicemail he told me Diane had never deleted, one she had apparently kept, whether out of guilt or grief or some instinct she herself couldn't explain. On an old phone that had eventually made its way through a chain of circumstances Curtis didn't fully detail and I didn't fully press him on, into evidence for that same unrelated shareholder matter. I want to be honest and tell you, I don't entirely know how Curtis came to possess it, and there was a part of me, sitting in that windowless print shop office, that decided I did not need to know. I read the transcript once, out loud, in a voice that did not sound entirely like my own. Walter is not walking out of this the same man, Diane. You need to think about protecting what is left. The message was dated 3 weeks before my trial even began, before a jury had returned a single verdict. Martin had already been telling my wife I was gone, already coaching her toward a future that did not include me, while I was still sitting in a county holding cell believing, with everything left in me, that the truth would eventually be enough to bring me home. I did not say anything for a long time. Curtis did not fill the silence either, which I came to understand later was its own kind of respect. The kind a good lawyer learns to offer a client who has just watched the last soft edge of what he believed about his own life get stripped away in front of him. When I finally spoke, my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I asked him what we had altogether if we needed to move. He counted it off on his fingers. A forged signature on the restructuring documents. A property transfer that predated the investigation by more than a year. Correspondence suggesting Martin had begun preparing to seize my assets before any public accusation existed. A voicemail suggesting he had actively worked to shape Diane's expectations of my future before my guilt or innocence had even been determined by a court. And underneath all of it, quietly, untouched, 41% of the operating company sitting in a trust Martin appeared not to know existed at all. It was not, Curtis said carefully, enough on its own to prove Martin had orchestrated the original fraud charges themselves. That was a separate question, a darker one we had not yet found solid ground to stand on. But it was more than enough, he said, to establish a pattern no honest board or honest judge could look at and still call what happened to my company an emergency rescue conducted in good faith. I asked him the question I had been circling for 3 weeks without letting myself land on it directly. Do you think Martin set me up? Do you think the original charges came from him? Curtis was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in his fingers, the way he used to do in board meetings when he was choosing his words with more care than usual. I think, he said finally, that we do not yet have proof of that. I think everything I have shown you tonight is consistent with a man who saw an opportunity and moved fast and ruthlessly to take advantage of it. I also think it is consistent with something worse. I'm not going to tell you which one it is until we have something solid enough to hang either version on. I respected that answer more than I would have respected a confident guess in either direction. It cost me something to sit with the uncertainty, but uncertainty, I had learned inside those walls, was a far more honest place to build a strategy from than a comfortable, unconfirmed conviction. Denise Whitfield agreed to meet me on a Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop 3 miles from the Cole Hayes Logistics headquarters, far enough that neither of us was likely to run into anyone who still worked there. She had run the front desk of my company for 19 years before my arrest, had known my handwriting, my coffee order, and the names of both my children's teachers better than most of my extended family did. And when she walked in and saw me sitting in the back booth, she stopped so completely still for a moment that I thought she might turn around and walk back out. She didn't. She sat down across from me, and her eyes filled before either of us said a word. I am sorry, she said. I should have called you the moment they changed the name on the building. I did not know how. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, and I meant it. 19 years of loyalty does not obligate a woman to risk her own livelihood reaching out to a man everyone around her had been told to treat as a cautionary tale. I asked her carefully, without pushing, what she had seen over the last 9 years from the inside. She told me things slowly, the way a person tells a story they have been carrying alone for a long time and are relieved finally to set down in front of someone who can carry part of the weight. She told me Martin had moved fast in the first year after my conviction, faster than anyone inside the company had expected, restructuring departments, replacing 3 of my longest-serving regional managers with men loyal to him personally, men who had no relationship to the company culture I had spent 2 decades building. She told me Jason had been given the title of operations partner within 8 months of my sentencing, a title I had never once discussed offering him before the trial. A title that came, as far as she could tell, with a salary he had never drawn a version of while I was still running things. She told me something else, something that made the coffee in my hand go cold before I'd finished half of it. She told me that in the months right before my trial, back when I was still a free man out on bail awaiting a verdict, Martin had quietly begun consolidating signing authority on several of the company's larger accounts, a shift she remembered specifically because she'd had to update the authorization paperwork herself and had thought at the time it was simply prudent contingency planning given how distracted I understandably was by my own defense. I asked her exactly when that consolidation had started. She thought about it for a long moment, then told me she believed it had begun almost immediately after the initial federal subpoena arrived at the office, months before the formal indictment, months before any of us, including me, had fully understood how serious the situation was going to become. I sat with that in the coffee shop for a long time after Denise left, turning it over the way you turn over a stone in your hand looking for the underside nobody has shown you yet. A man does not consolidate signing authority over his partner's largest accounts within days of a federal subpoena arriving unless he already suspects or already knows that the ground beneath that partner is about to give way. I did not yet have proof that Martin had built the trap I fell into. But I no longer believed, sitting in that booth with my coffee gone cold, that I was looking at a man who had simply taken advantage of misfortune that found me on its own. I believed I was looking at a man who had built the misfortune himself, brick by careful brick, over a period of months, while calling me his brother the entire time. I did not sleep well that night above Felix's shop. I lay on the narrow cot he'd set up for me in the storeroom, listening to the pipes tick as they cooled, and I thought about the 26 years I had spent building something I believed would outlast me. Something I believed I was building for my son the way my own father, despite everything he lost, had tried in his own broken way to build something worth inheriting for me. I thought about Jason standing in that warm golden living room with a crystal glass of scotch, discussing the exact monthly figure required to make his own father disappear quietly enough not to embarrass anyone at the next holiday gathering. I thought about Diane's voice on that voicemail transcript 3 weeks before my trial, already speaking about my future in the past tense. And I thought, for the first time since I had stood outside that window in the rain, that whatever I found in the weeks ahead, whatever the full and complete shape of the betrayal turned out to be, I was no longer walking toward the goal of simply reclaiming what belonged to me. I was walking toward the goal of finally understanding exactly how long I had been standing inside a story that was never really about protecting me at all. Curtis brought in a forensic document examiner named Harold Fing in the 4th week, a quiet, precise man in his 70s who had spent 30 years testifying in cases exactly like the one taking shape around me, and who looked at documents the way a jeweler looks at stones, turning them under a light most people never think to use. He compared the restructuring signature against 11 verified samples of my handwriting spanning 4 decades, and it took him less than 20 minutes to produce a written opinion, stating, in the careful, hedged language of a man who has learned the cost of overstatement, that the signature in question showed inconsistencies in stroke pressure, letter spacing, and pen lift patterns that were, in his professional judgment, inconsistent with genuine authorship. It was not, on its own, a criminal conviction. Curtis was careful to remind me of that more than once, but it was a foundation, the first piece of solid, defensible ground I had stood on since the night I watched 3 people I loved discuss the price of my disappearance through a rain-streaked window. I asked Curtis what came next, and he told me something I had been dreading and half expecting in equal measure. He told me that before we moved on Martin, before we filed anything, before we touched a single lever of the 41% sitting untouched in that old trust, I needed to talk to Diane, not to accuse her, not yet, to understand directly from her exactly how much she knew and exactly when she had known it, because everything that came after would depend on whether she had been a willing architect of what happened to me or a frightened woman led, one careful step at a time, into a decision she never fully understood the size of. I did not want to see her. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me had spent 5 weeks constructing a version of the conversation in my head where I never had to look at her face again, where the 41% and the forged signature and the document examiner's report did all the talking I couldn't bring myself to do. But Curtis was right, and I knew he was right, and there is a difference between a man who avoids something because it is beneath him and a man who avoids something because he is afraid of what it will cost him to face it honestly. I did not want to be the second kind of man. I went to the house on a Tuesday mid-morning, at a time I knew from Denise that Martin would be at the office and Jason would be with him. I did not call ahead. I walked up the same driveway I had turned away from 5 weeks earlier, past the same rose bed, and this time I climbed the front steps and rang the bell. It took a long moment for her to answer. When the door opened and she saw my face, her hand went to her mouth, and she stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like a full minute. Long enough that I began to wonder if she intended to speak at all. "Walter," she finally said, my name coming out of her in a way that sounded almost like grief, like she had been mourning me in some private corner of herself, even while sitting across a dinner table from a man who had taken my company from me. I told her I had been staying close by. I told her I needed to understand some things before I came home. She let me in. We sat at the same kitchen table where I had once fallen asleep over invoices with her jacket draped over my shoulders, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, the silence between us thick with everything neither of us yet knew how to say out loud. I asked her the only question I had come to ask, the one I had turned over so many times in the weeks above Felix's shop that it had worn smooth in my mind like a stone carried too long in a pocket. "Did you ever believe I did what they said I did?" She started crying before she could answer, and I understood the tears were an answer in themselves. "No," she said when she finally found words again. "Never. Not for one single day. But I did not know how to fight for you and keep this family standing at the same time, Walter. Martin kept telling me there was no version of this where I could do both. I believed that was true, or true enough. I do not think Diane sat down one afternoon and decided to betray me. I think she was frightened and exhausted, and being told over and over by a man she had trusted for 26 years that protecting her family meant handing him the keys to it. I do not think less of her for surviving 9 impossible months the only way she understood how to survive them. I told her that sitting at that table, and I meant it, and it was the first time either of us had cried openly in front of the other in longer than I could remember. But I did not tell her about the 41%. I did not tell her about the forged signature or the property transfer that predated the investigation by 14 months, or the voicemail she herself had apparently never been able to delete. I watched her across that table, grieving and frightened and relieved all at once, and I made a decision that cost me something to make, because it required me to sit across from a woman I still loved and hold back the exact truth that might have let her breathe easier in that moment. I asked her instead, carefully, about the timeline. I asked her when Martin had first come to her about protecting the estate. She thought about it, wiping her eyes, and told me it had been some time after the subpoenas arrived, in the first weeks of the investigation, when everything felt like it was collapsing all at once, and Martin had seemed, at the time, like the only person still standing calmly in the middle of the wreckage. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether she remembered anything happening before the subpoenas, any conversations, any unusual requests, any moments where Martin had seemed, in hindsight, to already know something was coming before the rest of us did. She was quiet for a long time, staring at her own hands on the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, gone smaller and more uncertain than it had been a moment before. "There was one thing," she said. "About 6 months before the raid, he asked me to have copies made of some of your personal financial documents. He told me it was for an insurance review. I did not think anything of it at the time. I sat very still. I asked her what kind of documents. 'Account numbers,' she said, 'signature samples, things from your home office desk.' I did not react the way every part of me wanted to react in that moment. I kept my voice level, the way I had trained myself to keep it level through 9 years of learning not to give anyone in a room full of predators a single visible crack to work with. I asked her as calmly as I could manage whether she still had any record of what exactly Martin had asked her to copy. Or when. She did not. It had been, in her memory, an unremarkable request from a man she trusted completely, the kind of small favor between old friends that nobody thinks to write down because nobody imagines, in the moment, that it will ever matter. I understood, sitting at that table, that I had just found the thread that connected everything Curtis and I had assembled over the last 5 weeks. Signature samples taken from my own home office 6 months before the raid, by a man my wife trusted enough not to question. A forged document that appeared, on close examination, to be a careful, patient study of my hand rather than a rushed forgery. A property transfer that predated the investigation by more than a year. A real estate inquiry that predated my indictment by 4 months. Martin had not simply taken advantage of my downfall. He had built the instrument that caused it, using a level of access my own wife had unknowingly handed him, 6 months before the federal government ever knocked on my door. I did not tell Diane what I now suspected. I want to explain why, because I have thought hard about whether that decision was the right one, and I am still not entirely certain. I did not tell her because I did not yet have proof solid enough to survive her disbelief, and because I understood, watching her across that table, that the moment I told her, some door inside her would close that I might need open a little longer. I needed her, for a little while longer, to keep behaving exactly as she had been behaving. I needed Martin to keep believing his story had worked. It cost me something to sit across from my wife and withhold the truth of what I now understood about the man standing beside her at every family dinner. I am not going to pretend that decision came easily, or that it came without a cost to whatever remained of the trust between us. But I had learned, in 9 years, that the men who win are rarely the ones who feel the most in any given moment. They are the ones who understand, with a kind of discipline that costs something real, exactly when feeling everything and showing everything are not the same thing at all. Before I left the house that morning, Diane asked me, very quietly, standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, whether I could ever forgive her. I told her I did not know yet. I told her that was the most honest answer I had. She nodded and did not ask me anything further, and I walked back down the driveway into a gray, ordinary morning that felt, somehow, heavier than the storm I had stood in 5 weeks earlier. I called Curtis from a payphone 3 blocks away and told him what I had learned. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a weight in it I had not heard from him before. "Walter," he said, "if Martin obtained your signature samples and account information 6 months before the raid and used them to build the paper trail the prosecution relied on to convict you, that is not corporate opportunism anymore. That is something a federal prosecutor would want to hear about directly." I told him I understood that. I told him I also understood that we did not yet have proof strong enough to make that accusation stick, and that the moment we made it and failed to prove it, Martin would have every advantage he needed to bury us both. "I need more," I told him. "I need to know exactly what he did with those account numbers. I need to see inside whatever system he built to route the money the prosecution said was mine." Curtis was quiet again, and when he spoke, I could hear for the first time in 5 weeks something like fear in his voice. Not for himself, but for me. "That information is not going to be sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, Walter," he said. "If it exists at all after 9 years, it is going to be somewhere Martin has made very sure nobody can reach it easily." I told him I understood that too. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a part of myself I had not fully acknowledged yet, even to myself, I had already begun to understand that the next phase of what I needed to do was not going to look like anything a document examiner or a property registry could hand me across a desk. Curtis found the way forward 2 days later, and it was not the way I had expected. I had spent those 2 days above Felix's shop turning over darker options in my mind, the kind of ideas a desperate man reaches for when the legal path in front of him looks too slow to survive the patience it demands. Curtis, when he called, talked me back from all of them with 4 words that turned out to matter more than anything else in the 6 weeks that followed. "You are still an owner," he said. I did not understand him at first. He explained it slowly, the way he used to explain complicated financing structures to me back when Hayes Industrial Supply was young and I did not yet have the vocabulary to follow him without help. The 41% sitting in the trust Curtis had set up in 2011 had never been touched by any of Martin's restructuring paperwork, which meant that under Illinois corporate law, I retained, as a documented minority owner of the operating company, a legal right to inspect the company's books and financial records. Not a favor. Not a request Martin could quietly decline. A right, enforceable in court if necessary, that existed independently of whatever narrative Martin had built around my supposed incapacity. It would not, on its own, get us access to whatever hidden system Martin had used to route the transfers that convicted me. But it would get us access to 8 months of Cole Hayes Logistics financial records, board minutes, and account authorizations, all of it produced under a formal legal obligation, all of it admissible, all of it obtained without either of us ever having to do anything Martin could later use to paint me as the aggressor in whatever came next. Curtis filed the inspection demand on a Thursday. It was a quiet, unremarkable piece of paperwork, the kind of document that draws no headlines and requires no drama. And it was, in its own way, the first genuinely aggressive move I had made since the night I stood outside my own living room window. Martin, Curtis told me, would have 15 business days to comply. I asked Curtis what would happen if Martin simply refused. Then, Curtis said, we go to a judge, and a judge asks Martin, under oath, exactly why the majority operator of a company is denying a documented minority owner the access the law guarantees him. That is not a conversation Martin wants to have in open court, Walter. Whatever he has built over the last 9 years, he has built it on the assumption that nobody was ever going to look closely enough to ask the question in the first place. While we waited on the inspection demand, I did something I had been avoiding for 5 weeks. I reached out to Jason. I sent the message from a burner phone Curtis had given me, keeping it simple, unthreatening, the kind of message a tired old man recently released from prison might reasonably send his son. I asked if he would meet me for coffee, just the 2 of us, before I signed anything or made any decisions about where I was going to live. I told him I wanted to see him alone, He agreed faster than I expected, and some small, foolish part of me let itself hope, for the length of one evening, that the boy sitting across from me the next morning might still be reachable, might still be, underneath whatever he had let himself become over 9 years, the boy who used to ride on my shoulders at company picnics and ask me with total seriousness whether I owned all the trucks in the whole world. He was not late, which surprised me, and he did not hug me when I sat down across from him in the corner booth of a diner near his office, which did not. He looked well. Expensive suit, the kind of watch that costs more than most people's cars, a posture that belonged to a man who had never once had to sit across a table from someone with real power over his future and feel small in front of them. I let myself play the part I had been rehearsing for 5 weeks. I told him how sorry I was to have missed so many years of his life. I let my voice crack, carefully, at the mention of his college graduation, an event I had genuinely missed by 3 years and genuinely grieved, though not in the performative way I was allowing myself to display it now. I watched him grow visibly uncomfortable with the raw emotion, the way young men often do when a father shows them a version of grief they have no practiced response for, and I used that discomfort deliberately the way a man uses any tool available to him. I asked him, gently, almost idly, how he and his mother had managed financially in the early months after my arrest, when the federal government had frozen every account with my name attached to it. He tensed immediately. I watched it happen across his shoulders, across his jaw, a small defensive contraction that told me more in half a second than an hour of direct questioning would have managed. He picked up a sugar packet from the table and began tearing it into small, precise pieces, a nervous habit I recognized from when he was 12 years old and failing a math class he was too proud to admit he was struggling with. "You do not need to worry about the details," he said, his words coming out clipped and fast in a way that told me he had rehearsed this particular deflection more than once. "Martin handled everything." I kept my voice as light as I could manage. I asked him how, specifically. I reminded him that the college fund had been frozen along with everything else, that Diane had no independent income of her own at the time, that from where I was sitting, the math of how they had survived those months simply did not add up without help from somewhere I had not yet identified. He looked out the window for a long moment, and when he looked back at me, something in his expression had hardened, the discomfort replaced by a flicker of the same arrogant impatience I had heard in his voice through the glass of my own living room window 5 weeks earlier. "Martin set up a trust for me when I turned 18, he said. "Dad, we were fine. You do not need to stress about it." I sat very still. Jason had turned 28 3 months before my release. If Martin had established a trust for him at 18, that placed the funding a full decade before my arrest, 2 full years before the federal investigation had even begun, at a time when I was still sitting in the chief executive's chair, still working 80-hour weeks, still, as far as I understood at the time, the sole architect of every dollar Martin had access to on behalf of the company. A decade. Martin had been quietly funneling resources toward my son for 10 years, before anyone accused me of a single crime. I did not let any of what I was feeling show on my face. I have had a great deal of practice, by that point, at holding a storm perfectly still behind an expression of tired, grateful confusion. I thanked him softly for explaining, told him I was relieved to hear they had been taken care of, and let the conversation move on to smaller, safer things, the kind of surface conversation two people have when neither one is willing to say the real thing sitting between them. Jason left first, tapping his watch, telling me he had a meeting he could not be late for. He did not offer to pay for the coffee. I sat alone in that booth for a long time after he left, turning over the new shape of what I now understood. This had never been a story about a business partner who took advantage of a friend's downfall. This was a story about a man who had spent a decade, at minimum, building parallel structures of loyalty and dependency around my own family, patiently, invisibly, long before any federal agent ever had reason to look twice at Hayes Industrial Supply. I did not yet understand why. I understood, sitting in that booth with 2 cold cups of coffee in front of me, that I needed to. The inspection demand produced its first real fruit on the 12th business day, 3 days ahead of the deadline, when Martin's corporate counsel, apparently unwilling to risk a judge asking uncomfortable questions in open court, delivered 8 months of financial records to Curtis's office in 4 heavy binders. We spent 2 full nights going through them at the print shop office, Curtis with a legal pad and a highlighter, me with a growing, cold understanding settling into my chest with every page. Martin had not simply preserved Hayes Industrial Supply during my absence. the way his story to Diane had framed it. He had aggressively expanded the company's exposure to a category of client Hayes had never touched before my arrest: logistics contracts tied to government and defense procurement, the kind of high-margin, high-scrutiny work that required security clearances and compliance infrastructure I had never built because I had never wanted the company anywhere near that level of federal entanglement. Buried in the fourth binder, in a section of appendices most casual readers would have skimmed past, I found a reference to a proprietary logistics routing system the company was licensing internally, described in the documentation as originally developed under Martin Cole's technical direction beginning 11 years earlier. 11 years earlier placed the origin of that system squarely inside a period when I was still the sole architect of every piece of technical infrastructure Hayes Industrial Supply owned. I had spent 4 years of late nights, personally, coding the early framework of a routing optimization system I had never finished, never patented, never even formally documented beyond a set of private files on my own home office computer, because I had never trusted anyone else with early access to something I believed, even then, could become one of the company's most valuable assets. I sat in that print shop office at nearly 2 a.m, staring at a single line in a corporate appendix that credited another man with the origin of something I had built with my own hands, in my own home office, on nights when everyone else in my family was asleep, and I understood, finally, with total clarity, exactly what had been taken from me. Not just a company, not just a house, not just 9 years. He had taken the thing I built in private, in silence, for no reason except that I loved building it, and he had put his own name on it, and used it to secure contracts worth more money than I had earned in the first 15 years of the company's existence. Curtis, watching my face across the table, asked quietly whether I was all right. I told him I was not, and that I did not intend to be all right again until every part of this was set right. Curtis and I spent the better part of the following week deciding how to use what we had. And it was during that week that I finally understood the full weight of a lesson I had only half learned inside those prison walls: that having the truth in your hands is not the same as having power. A man can be entirely right and still lose if he moves before he understands exactly how to spend what he knows. We agreed on a plan with 2 separate tracks. The first was quiet and formal. As a documented 41% owner, I had the legal standing to demand an emergency shareholder meeting, a right Martin could delay through procedural maneuvering but not deny outright without inviting exactly the kind of judicial scrutiny his corporate counsel had already shown itself unwilling to risk. Curtis filed the demand on a Monday, setting a hard date 3 weeks out, enough time, he calculated, for Martin to feel the walls beginning to close without enough time for him to fully dismantle whatever else he might still be hiding. The second track was quieter still, and it belonged almost entirely to me. I intended to keep being exactly the man Martin believed he had already broken, right up until the morning of that meeting. I want to explain something about that decision, because I understand how it might sound from the outside. It is not weakness to let your enemy believe he has already won. It is not surrender to smile at a man who has taken everything from you and let him think the smile is gratitude. I had learned, in 9 years surrounded by men far more dangerous than Martin Cole, that the moment you let an opponent see the shape of your actual strength is the moment he stops making the mistakes his overconfidence would otherwise guarantee. Every additional week Martin believed I was still the broken, grateful old man from that first embrace on the porch. Was a week he continued making decisions from a position of false safety. And false safety, in my experience, makes men careless in exactly the ways that eventually cost them everything. So I let Diane bring me small things during those weeks. A coat that had once been mine, pulled from a closet she had apparently never emptied. An invitation delivered almost shyly to come to Sunday dinner once I was, in her words, feeling more settled. I declined the dinner for as long as I reasonably could, citing the fragile nerves of a man readjusting to freedom, and I understood, watching her face fall slightly each time, that some part of what I was doing to her in those weeks was its own kind of cruelty, however necessary I believed it to be. I am not going to pretend that cost me nothing. It cost me more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal, watching a woman I still, despite everything, had not stopped loving, wait patiently for a husband who was quietly building the case that would end her comfortable life alongside the men who had built it for her. The shareholder meeting demand reached Martin's desk on a Tuesday, and Denise, Still, my quiet channel into the building I had built and no longer controlled told me over a hurried phone call 2 days later that something had visibly shifted in the executive floor's atmosphere. Martin had canceled 2 scheduled meetings. He had spent an unusual amount of time behind closed doors with the company's outside counsel. He had, according to Denise, asked her directly, in a tone she described as trying too hard to sound casual, whether she had heard anything from me since my release. I want you to understand what that question meant, coming from Martin. A man who genuinely believes he has already won does not need to ask his former employee whether the man he defeated has been in contact with anyone. That question was the first crack I had confirmation of, the first small sign that somewhere behind his composed exterior, Martin had begun to suspect that the version of me walking around Highland Park was not entirely the version he had planned for. He came to see me himself the following Thursday at Felix's shop, which meant he had done enough looking to find out exactly where I'd been staying for the better part of 2 months. I remember the small, cold satisfaction of watching him step through the door in an expensive coat entirely wrong for the neighborhood, glancing around at the shelves of fittings and hardware with the barely concealed distaste of a man who has forgotten or never truly understood what it is to build something with your own hands from nothing. He wore the same warm, brotherly smile he had worn on the porch 9 years and 5 weeks earlier. The one that had greeted me home with an embrace that made my stomach turn even as I forced myself to return it. "Walter," he said, "man, it is good to see you settling back in. I have been meaning to come find you, get you caught up on everything." I told him to sit down. He did, choosing the chair across the small counter with the easy confidence of a man who still believed he was the one in control of whatever conversation was about to happen. I told him I knew about the signature. I watched something flicker across his face, gone almost before I could name it. I told him I knew about the voicemail he had left Diane weeks before my trial had even concluded. I told him I knew about the property transfer that predated the federal investigation by 14 months, and the real estate inquiry that predated my indictment by 4. I told him I knew about the trust he had established for Jason a full decade before anyone had accused me of a single crime. He tried denial first, the way I had expected he would, his voice rising into a register of wounded innocence I recognized from board meetings a lifetime ago, back when he used exactly that tone to explain away a missed quarterly target. "Whatever this looks like, Walter," he began, and I let him get exactly that far before I stopped him. "I am not asking you to explain it," I told him. "I am telling you what happens next." I laid it out for him plainly, the way Curtis and I had rehearsed it. He had until the shareholder meeting to voluntarily step down from his operating position, transfer his shares back into the original partnership structure, and walk away from Cole Hayes Logistics entirely, which by that point would revert, in name and in fact, back to Hayes Industrial Supply. If he did this quietly, without forcing us into open litigation, I told him Curtis and I had agreed not to pursue the forgery allegation criminally, not out of mercy exactly, but because I had spent enough of my own life inside a courtroom and did not particularly want to spend the years remaining to me sitting in another one, even as the man asking the questions instead of answering them. He tried the friendship next, the 26 years, the wedding, the hospital hallway where he had held my newborn son because I had been too nervous to hold him myself. I let him say all of it. I had turned every version of that speech over in my own mind so many times during the 6 weeks above Felix's shop that hearing it out loud from him produced almost nothing in me at all. A strange, hollow quiet, where I had expected, right up until that moment, that real anger might still be waiting. "You had my trust for 26 years, I told him, when he finally ran out of things to say. You spent every bit of it, apparently, over a period of at least a decade, patiently building a way to take everything I had. That is not a friendship I have any interest in salvaging, but I am not interested in destroying you completely either. I want what belongs to me back, and I want you gone from my company and my family's life." He left without agreeing to anything, which I had expected. Men who have spent a decade quietly engineering the downfall of someone who trusted them completely do not surrender to a single conversation, however much evidence sits behind it. But he left rattled in a way I had not seen from him even through the glass of my own living room window 5 weeks earlier, and rattled, I understood, was exactly the state I needed him in going into the 3 weeks before that shareholder meeting. The next escalation did not come from Martin. It came from Jason, 4 days later, in the form of a lawsuit filed against me personally, claiming I had wrongfully interfered with a trust he alleged was a legitimate inheritance from a man he described, in the filing, as his godfather and business mentor. Curtis showed me the paperwork with an expression I had not seen on him before, somewhere between grim and impressed. "He is trying to get ahead of what he thinks is coming," Curtis said. "He knows something is moving. He does not know exactly what yet. But he is scared enough to make a preemptive move, and scared men make mistakes, Walter. This filing puts his financial relationship with Martin on the public record under oath in exactly the kind of detail we could never have compelled any other way." I read through the filing twice, feeling something colder and more clarifying than anger settle into me as I did. My son, the boy who had once ridden on my shoulders asking if I owned every truck in the world, had chosen, faced with the first real sign that his comfortable inheritance might be threatened, not to call me, not to ask a single question, but to file a lawsuit against his own father to protect money that had, by every piece of evidence Curtis and I had assembled, never legitimately belonged to him in the first place. I sat with that for a long time in the quiet of Felix's storeroom that night, and I understood, finally, that whatever version of reconciliation I had allowed myself to quietly hope for in the weeks since my release, the version where Jason turned out to be a boy led astray who could still find his way back to me, was not the version of reality I was actually standing inside. I was 3 weeks from a shareholder meeting that would determine the future of everything I had built, and I understood, that night, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so many weeks of uncertainty, that I was no longer fighting to save my family. I was fighting to take back what was mine, and to let the people who had tried to bury me finally understand exactly what they had built their comfortable lives on top of. I told Diane everything 4 days before the shareholder meeting. I want to explain why I chose that particular moment, because the timing mattered more than almost any other decision I made in those 6 weeks. I could have told her earlier, in the kitchen, the week I first came home, and let her carry the weight of the full truth alongside me through everything that followed. I could have waited until after the meeting, let her learn it the same way the rest of the world eventually would, through documents and headlines and the cold, impersonal language of a corporate filing. I chose instead to tell her just before, close enough to the reckoning that she would have no time to warn anyone, far enough ahead that she would have a genuine choice about which side of what was coming she wanted to stand on. I am not proud of the calculation in that. I want to be honest about it rather than dress it up as something gentler than it was. But I had spent 9 years learning that mercy and strategy are not always opposites, and that sometimes the kindest thing a man can do for someone he still loves is give her the truth early enough to act on it, even if the timing of that truth is chosen, in part, for reasons that have nothing to do with kindness at all. We sat at the same kitchen table where I had once slept over invoices with her jacket over my shoulders. I laid it out for her the way Curtis had laid it out for me weeks earlier, methodically, document by document, giving her time to absorb each piece before moving to the next. The signature samples taken from my home office under the pretense of an insurance review. The property transfer that predated the investigation by 14 months. The real estate inquiry that predated my indictment. The trust established for Jason a full decade before any accusation existed. The voicemail she herself had never been able to bring herself to delete. I watched something break in her face as I spoke, piece by piece, a kind of slow structural collapse that was almost harder to witness than the scene I had watched through the living room window 10 weeks earlier. When I finished, she sat very still for a long time, staring at the stack of papers between us, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone flat in a way I had never heard from her before, not even in the worst months of my trial. "He asked me for those signature samples 6 months before the subpoenas arrived," she said. "I thought it was for insurance. I never once thought to ask why an insurance review needed your signature and not mine." She looked up at me, and I watched a different kind of understanding move across her face, one that had nothing to do with the documents in front of her and everything to do with 30 years of memory rearranging itself around a single unbearable question. "Walter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think he built the case against you? Do you think he is the reason you went to prison at all?" I told her I did not have final proof of that yet, but that everything Curtis and I had assembled pointed in exactly that direction, and that I intended, at the shareholder meeting 4 days from now, to find out. She did not defend him. I want to note that clearly, because it mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened in those final days before the meeting. She did not offer a single word in Martin's favor. She sat across from me at that table, 30 years of marriage and 9 years of quiet, patient manipulation collapsing in on themselves at once, and she asked me finally what I needed from her. I told her the truth. I told her I needed her to attend the meeting, and I needed her, if it came to it, to testify honestly about the timeline of what Martin had asked of her, when he had asked it, and what he had told her about why. She agreed without hesitation, and something in the way she said it, steady and clear despite everything, told me that whatever else had happened between us, whatever repair or ruin still waited on the other side of what was coming, the woman across that table was choosing, finally, in the moment it counted most, to stand on the side of the truth rather than the side of her own comfort. The shareholder meeting was held in the same conference room where I had once run quarterly reviews for 22 years. A room with a long walnut table and a view of the loading docks I could still, even after 9 years away, have navigated blind. 11 board members sat around that table, along with Martin's outside counsel, a court reporter Curtis had insisted on hiring independently to create a record no one could later dispute, and, in the back corner, quiet and composed in a dark blue dress, Diane. Martin arrived last, deliberately, the way a man arrives who still believes he controls the room he is walking into. He greeted several board members warmly on his way to his seat, performing, right up until the moment he sat down across from me, the same easy confidence that had carried him through 9 years of careful, patient theft. I let Curtis open. That had been our plan from the beginning, the quiet legal foundation laid first, methodically, before anything more personal entered the room. Curtis walked the board through the 41% trust, its untouched status throughout the entire restructuring period, and the legal standing it gave me to demand this meeting in the first place. He walked them through the forged signature and Harold Feng's written opinion. He walked them through the property transfer that predated the federal investigation by 14 months, and the correspondence with the real estate agent that predated my indictment by 4. I watched Martin's face throughout, and I want to tell you honestly that for the first 15 minutes, he held himself together remarkably well, offering small, composed objections, requesting clarification on dates, behaving in every visible way, like a man confident the board would eventually see this as the bitter grievance of a broken old partner trying to reclaim relevance. That composure did not survive Diane. Curtis called her forward, gently, and asked her, on the record, to describe the circumstances under which Martin had requested copies of my signature samples and account information roughly 6 months before the federal subpoenas arrived at Hayes Industrial Supply. She spoke clearly, without flinching, describing the conversation almost exactly as she had described it to me at the kitchen table days earlier. An insurance review, Martin had told her. Nothing to worry about. Just a formality. I watched 2 board members exchange a glance across the table, the kind of glance that told me, before anyone said another word, that the story Martin had spent 9 years telling this room about a loyal partner who had simply stepped up during a crisis was beginning finally to come apart in front of the people whose confidence he needed most. Martin tried to recover. He stood, addressing the board directly, his voice carrying the same warm, reasonable tone I remembered from 100 meetings in that exact room, and he told them that whatever timeline Walter and his attorney had constructed, it was circumstantial, incomplete, the product of a man understandably bitter after 9 years of incarceration, looking for someone to blame. It might have worked, even then, if Curtis had not saved the routing algorithm for last. He laid it out simply, the proprietary logistics system the company credited, in its own internal documentation, to Martin's technical direction 11 years earlier. The private files, still recoverable from an old personal backup Curtis had located through a records request tied to my original home office equipment, files time-stamped years before Martin had ever claimed involvement, files that contained early drafts of code architecture I had written myself, alone, on nights when the rest of my family was asleep. Martin's composure finally broke at that. I watched it happen in real time, the confident set of his shoulders collapsing inward, the practiced warmth draining out of his face and leaving something older and more frightened underneath it. Something that looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a man who understood he was no longer the one controlling the story. He did not confess, not fully, Not in that room. Men rarely do, in my experience, even when the evidence against them has become undeniable. He offered explanations that grew smaller and more tangled with every sentence, and the board, watching him unravel in real time, did not need him to confess. They needed only to see, clearly, for the first time in 9 years, exactly which of the two men sitting at that table had actually built the thing they had spent a decade believing belonged to someone else. The board voted, by the end of that meeting, to suspend Martin's operating authority pending a full independent audit and to restore my position as controlling owner of the company effective immediately on the strength of the 41% trust combined with the overwhelming evidence of fraudulent restructuring that Curtis had laid before them. It was not in that room the end of anything. It was, I understood even as the board members filed out around me, only the beginning of a much longer reckoning, one that would eventually have to move beyond a conference room and into a courtroom, one that would eventually have to answer, in front of a judge rather than a board, the darkest question still hanging unanswered over everything that had happened to me. Had Martin built the case that sent me to prison in the first place? I did not yet know the answer. But for the first time in 9 years, I finally had the standing, the resources, and the evidence to find out. The independent audit took 11 weeks, and I spent most of them back in the office I had not sat in for 9 years, relearning the particular exhaustion of running a company rather than simply owning a piece of one. Curtis handled the legal side of what came next, and it was Curtis who finally brought me, on a gray Tuesday morning, the piece of information that answered the question that had followed me since the night I stood outside my own living room window. The forensic accountants the board had authorized found what 9 years of a federal investigation, ironically, had never bothered to look for, because 9 years earlier, nobody investigating me had any reason to suspect the fraud might have originated somewhere other than my own accounts. Buried in a server migration log from the period immediately preceding my arrest, they found evidence that the offshore transfers used to convict me had been initiated from an IP address registered to a property Martin owned privately, a small rental unit 2 miles from my house that had never appeared on any list of company assets, using credentials that matched, in every technical detail Harold Fung's earlier analysis had already flagged as suspicious, the signature samples and account information Diane had unknowingly handed him under the pretense of an insurance review. Martin had not simply capitalized on my downfall. He had manufactured it, deliberately, using access my own family had trusted him with, in order to remove me from a company he intended, even then, to eventually claim as his own. I want to tell you honestly what I felt reading that report, because I think it matters more than anything else I can describe about the whole 9 years. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel the clean, satisfying rush of vindication I might have expected to feel, sitting in a cell for the better part of a decade imagining the day someone finally proved I had told the truth all along. I felt mostly a kind of exhausted grief for the 26 years I had spent building a friendship with a man capable of doing something like this to someone who trusted him completely, and for the version of myself who had never once, in all that time, seen it coming. Curtis took the findings to the same federal investigator who had originally built the case against me, a man named Agent Reyes who, according to Curtis, had never entirely stopped wondering, in the years since my conviction, why the paper trail against me had been so unusually, suspiciously clean. Reyes did not need much convincing. Within a month, a new federal investigation had opened, this one aimed squarely at Martin, built on evidence solid enough that even his considerable resources could not fully insulate him from what followed. He was indicted 8 months later on charges of wire fraud, identity-based financial manipulation, and conspiracy, charges that mirrored, with an almost unbearable symmetry, the exact language of the indictment that had once been used against me. I did not attend every day of his trial. I attended enough of it to watch, from a distance I had earned the right to keep, as the story he had spent a decade building around himself came apart in a courtroom instead of a boardroom, in front of a jury instead of a company he no longer controlled. He was convicted on all counts. The sentencing judge, weighing the deliberate, sustained nature of what he had done, gave him considerably longer than the term I had served for a crime I never committed. I did not feel joy watching the verdict read. I felt mostly a quiet settling, the particular stillness that comes when a question that has followed you for years finally, completely, stops asking itself. My own conviction was vacated 4 months after Martin's sentencing, on the strength of the same evidence that had convicted him. It is a strange thing to have your name formally, legally cleared of a crime nearly a decade after the sentence for it has already been served in full. There is no ceremony for it, no moment where the years are handed back to you. I stood in a courtroom while a judge read a short procedural statement into the record, and then I walked out onto the same courthouse steps where, 9 years and some months earlier, I had been led away in handcuffs in front of news cameras that had, at the time, treated my guilt as an established fact rather than an accusation still awaiting trial. There were no cameras waiting for me this time. I remember standing on those steps for a long moment, in an ordinary gray coat, an ordinary free man, feeling the strange, almost anticlimactic weight of an ending that had taken so long to arrive it no longer matched the size of what I had imagined it would feel like. Diane was there. She had been there for most of it in the months since that shareholder meeting, in a way that surprised me more than I let her know at the time. We had not simply resumed our marriage the way it had been before, and I do not think either of us wanted to. Something had broken in the space of those 9 years that could not be repaired by simply pretending the breaking had never happened. But she had chosen, in every meaningful moment since that kitchen table conversation, to stand on the side of the truth rather than the side of the comfortable life Martin had built for her. And that choice, made and remade a dozen times over 11 difficult months, had begun to rebuild something between us that was different from what we'd had before, slower, more careful, but real in a way I had not expected to find again. Jason's lawsuit against me collapsed the same week the audit findings became public. His attorney withdrew from the case within days, and Jason, faced with the full weight of what the trust he had defended so aggressively had actually been built from, did not contact me for several months afterward. When he finally did, it was a short, awkward letter rather than a phone call, an acknowledgement more than an apology that he had chosen comfort over questions for longer than he was proud of. I have not fully forgiven him. I want to be honest about that because I think a story that resolves every wound too neatly is not telling the truth about what betrayal actually costs a family. I have let him back into my life carefully, in small increments, the way you let weight back onto an injury that has not fully healed. He works now, on his own, at a logistics firm 2 states away, a mid-level position he took, according to what little he has told me, because he needed to understand what it actually meant to build something rather than inherit it. I do not know yet whether that is a genuine transformation or a temporary posture adopted in the wreckage of everything he lost. I have decided for now to let time answer that question instead of deciding it for him. I stood in my office on the 40th floor on a quiet evening some months after Martin's sentencing, looking out over a city skyline I had once believed I understood completely. And I thought about my father, sitting in his folding chair by the window in Gary, telling a much younger version of me that a man's whole worth could be measured by 2 things, what he built and what he refused to take from someone who trusted him. I did not feel the size of the victory the way I had spent 9 years imagining I would. I felt mostly tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The particular exhaustion of a man who has spent half a year holding himself perfectly still so that everyone around him would go on making the mistakes he needed them to make. Getting the company back had cost me a marriage I was still rebuilding on entirely different terms, a son I was not yet sure I would ever fully recognize again, and a friendship I had once believed would outlast both of us. I understood standing there at the window that none of it had come free. I understood, too, that I would have paid the same price again without hesitating, because the alternative, walking through that front door 9 weeks earlier and letting them finish burying the truth along with the rest of me, had never actually been the cheaper option. It only ever felt that way in the moment, the way giving up always does. I sold the Highland Park estate a little over a year after my release. I want to explain that decision because I know it might read, on the surface, as an odd choice for a man who had just spent 9 years fighting to reclaim everything that had been taken from him. The house had never really been the thing I was fighting for, though. It took me most of that first year to understand that clearly enough to act on it. The house was where I had stood in the rain and watched the last version of my old life dissolve in front of me. Every room in it, no matter how carefully we tried to make it feel like ours again, carried some residue of that night. Some faint, unshakable echo of the golden light in the fireplace and the 3 people inside who had, for a period of months I still cannot fully account for, treated my absence as an inheritance already spent. Diane and I bought a smaller house together, closer to the water, plainer than anything either of us had lived in during the years of the company's largest growth. It has a kitchen table we bought new, deliberately rather than moving the old one, and I think we both understood, without ever needing to say it out loud, why that particular piece of furniture was the one thing from the old house neither of us wanted to carry forward. We are not, I want to be honest, the same two people who married under a leaking tent in her mother's backyard almost 40 years ago. Something in both of us changed permanently during those 9 years, in different directions, for different reasons, and the marriage we have now is a slower, more careful thing than the one we had before, built less on the easy, unexamined trust of two young people who had never yet been tested, and more on the harder, more deliberate choice two older people make, every day, to keep choosing honesty even when it costs them something. I do not know if that is a lesser kind of love than what we had before. I have come to believe most days that it might actually be a truer one. Curtis stayed on as the company's general counsel, a position he had more than earned across 18 years of loyal service and 6 additional weeks of quiet, patient work that had saved everything I had left to save. I made him a partner in the business the following spring, not as a gift, but as an acknowledgement of something I'd come to understand clearly during those months above Felix's shop. That the people who stand beside you honestly during your worst season deserve a stake in whatever you manage to rebuild out of it in a way that goes beyond a salary or a title. Denise still runs the front desk, though these days she also oversees a small team, and she has never once, in all the months since my return, let me forget the 2 phone calls she quietly declined to make on Martin's behalf during those early weeks. A small, stubborn act of loyalty I have tried, in whatever ways I can, to repay many times over. Felix's shop is still standing 2 towns over, and I still stop by most weeks, not out of any remaining need for a place to hide, but because the man who let a broken, invisible stranger sleep above his hardware shop without ever once asking for an explanation is not the kind of friendship a man simply lets fade once he no longer needs it. I have quietly become one of his largest suppliers, at fair market rates, because Felix would never have accepted anything else, and because some debts are better repaid in the ordinary language of continued business than in any gesture large enough to embarrass the person who never asked to be thanked in the first place. Martin, as far as I understand from the periodic updates Curtis still receives through legal channels neither of us particularly enjoys engaging with, remains where the court sent him. I have not visited. I do not intend to. There was a period in the first months after his conviction when I turned over the question of whether I owed him some final conversation, some closing of the 26 years we had once called a friendship. I have decided, in the time since, that the closing already happened, in a print shop office at 2 in the morning, reading a corporate appendix that credited another man with something I had built alone in the quiet hours after everyone else in my house had gone to sleep. Some conversations do not need to be spoken out loud to be finished. I started a foundation last year, funded initially out of my own recovered assets, and increasingly, as word has spread through the kind of quiet channels that exist among people who have survived similar things, out of contributions from others who found their way to us after reading about the case in the business press. We fund legal defense for people facing wrongful prosecution who cannot afford the kind of representation that eventually saved my life, people without a Curtis Boyd already in their corner, without a 41% trust sitting quietly untouched in the background of a catastrophe they never saw coming. It is not a grand gesture. It does not undo 9 years or repair every fracture that remains in my family, or bring back the friendship I once genuinely believed would last the whole of both our lives. But it is, I have come to understand, the only kind of legacy that actually means something to a man my age. Not the size of the company you leave behind, but the number of people who never have to learn, the way I learned, exactly how long it can take the truth to catch up with a lie, if nobody with resources and patience is willing to help it along. I think often these days about the particular kind of quiet that settled over me in the 6 weeks between the night I stood outside my own living room window and the morning I finally walked back through my own front door, no longer pretending to be the broken man they expected. I have heard people describe that kind of patience as coldness, and I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I let a woman I loved cry in front of me without telling her everything I already knew. I let a company celebrate a stolen legacy for weeks longer than I needed to, so that the men who had stolen it would have more time to grow careless in their certainty. I sat across a diner table from my own son and let him believe, for a little while longer, that his tears had moved me more than they actually had. I do not think that was coldness. I think it was the only form discipline can take, when a man has been stripped of every other kind of power and has to build his way back to strength one quiet, unglamorous decision at a time. Rage would have gotten me nothing but a return trip to the same kind of cell I had just spent 9 years learning to survive. Grief, indulged too openly and too soon, would have handed every advantage to people who were counting on exactly that reaction to keep me manageable. What got me back, everything that mattered, was something slower and less satisfying to watch than either of those. Something that does not make for a dramatic story in the moment it is actually happening, because from the outside, for 6 long weeks, it looked like nothing at all. It looked like an old man sweeping a hardware shop floor for cash, riding buses, drinking cold coffee across from a son who did not deserve his patience yet. It was, underneath all of that stillness, the most active thing I have ever done in my life. There is a photograph I keep now on the shelf behind my desk, one I did not have in the old office, one I never would have thought to display in the years when the company was young and every wall in that building was reserved for the next quarter's targets instead of anything as sentimental as memory. It is a picture of a rented panel van with a cracked windshield parked outside the very first warehouse I ever leased, taken by Diane on a disposable camera the week we opened for business, back when neither of us had any idea whether the whole thing would survive its first winter. I look at it some mornings before anyone else arrives, and I think about the man standing beside that van, 26 years old, certain that if he simply worked hard enough and stayed honest enough, nothing could ever take away what he was building. I do not think that man was foolish for believing that. I think he was simply young, in the particular way that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with never yet having been tested by someone willing to spend a decade of patient deception just to take what he had built. I am 62 years old now. I have buried a friendship I once believed would outlast me. I have watched a marriage nearly end and then, slowly, unevenly, choose to continue on different terms than the ones it started with. I have sat across a table from a son who is still, some days, more stranger to me than family, and I have let that distance stay exactly as large as it honestly is, rather than pretending it closed faster than it actually has. None of that makes for a tidy ending, and I have stopped expecting one. What I have instead is something I think matters more than a tidy ending ever could. I know now, in a way I did not know at 26, exactly what I am capable of when everything I trusted turns out to have been built on a lie. I am capable of quiet. I am capable of patience long enough to make careless men mistake it for defeat. And when the moment finally comes, when the evidence is finally solid enough and the timing is finally right, I am capable of taking back exactly what belongs to me, without needing to destroy every last thing standing near it in order to feel like I have won. That is not revenge. I understand now, in a way I did not fully understand standing in the rain outside my own window that first night, that revenge was never actually the thing I wanted, however much some part of me, in the rawest hour of that betrayal, believed it was. What I wanted, underneath all of it, was simpler and harder to name. I wanted the truth to finally weigh more than the story 3 people had spent 9 years telling about me. I wanted to stop being the version of myself other people had decided to believe in, and become, one patient week at a time, the version I actually was. I got that back. Not all at once and not without cost, but I got it back. My father used to tell me, sitting in that folding chair by the window in Gary, that a man's whole worth could be measured by what he built and what he refused to take from someone who trusted him. I understand that lesson differently now than I did the day he first said it to me. I think he was telling me, without quite having the words for it himself, that the second half of that measure only means anything once you have been tested by someone who failed it completely. You do not know what you refused to take from people who trusted you until you have stood across from someone who took everything from you instead and discovered, in the aftermath, exactly which kind of man you still chose to be. I chose patience. I chose the truth, even when it was slower and less satisfying than the anger waiting right beside it. And I chose, in the end, to build something worth leaving behind that has nothing to do with revenge at all. If you are sitting somewhere tonight carrying a betrayal of your own, from someone you trusted the way I trusted mine, I am not going to tell you the answer is always patience, or that every story like this one ends the way mine did. I do not know your circumstances, and I would be lying if I told you every quiet, careful choice I made across those 6 weeks was easy, or that I never once wanted to smash that glass and tear the whole thing apart with my bare hands instead. I will tell you only this. The people who betray you are almost always counting on your grief to be louder than your patience. They are counting on you to move too fast, to feel too much in front of them, to hand them, in your first unguarded reaction, exactly the confirmation they need that they were right to underestimate you. Do not give them that confirmation a moment before you are ready to. What would you have done, standing outside that window in the rain, watching the people you trusted most decide quietly, over a stack of papers, exactly how much of your own life you deserved to keep? I would genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from tonight. I read every single one.